Now, in our breaking news, former Judge John Hlophe has resigned from the Judicial Service Commission. He was interdicted from taking part. The JSC today began interviewing candidates to fill 21 vacancies. Ziyanda Ngcobo joins us now live. Ziyanda, very good afternoon to you. Breaking news of Dr. John Hlophe now resigning from the JSC. What impact will this have on the interviews that are currently taking place?
None at all, Katlego. In fact, that's the whole point. The Western Cape High Court had actually made a judgment and had contemplated the consequences of John Hlophe's absence in these interviews. You'll recall that that judgment was handed down on the 27th of September. It was a matter that was brought by Freedom Under Law, the DA, and Corruption Watch. And in its statements, Katlego, the MK party says that it will not allow the name of Dr. John Hlophe to be associated or used to legitimize a patently misleading, fraudulent and improperly constituted Judicial Services Commission. So that's in the statement by the MK party, of course, announcing then the resignation of Dr. John Hlophe from the JSC. Now let me bring in a Freedom Under Law. They're obviously here to monitor the proceedings, but of course then Chris Oxtoby, the breaking news coming out. And I cannot help but think then, after all the litigation, what was the point then if he would ultimately withdraw?
Well, I think we've got to the right outcome. I mean, the objections that ourselves and other organizations raised to Dr. Hlophe sitting on the JSC in the first place, we at least have got to the point where I think that him stepping down is the correct outcome. As you say, the question of the litigation, the costs that have been incurred in that litigation, the issue of what happens about allegations of contemptuous media statements that the MK party made before, all of those are really still live issues. We have to wait and see what happens with that. So I think there is also an extent to which one just has to wait and see what happens with the litigation, which up until earlier today was still ongoing. But we've got to an outcome that I think is correct, namely his resignation.
And of course, we were waiting for the Western Cape High Court to actually hand down a ruling on Part B, which was basically looking at whether or not the National Assembly's decision to even designate him to this very Judicial Services Commission was rational in and of itself. Does it now render, with his resignation, that matter moot? Is it now just an academic exercise?
That's a good question. I mean, there are aspects of it, as I've mentioned, that are not completely academic. The costs question, for one. The question of whether some of the remarks that have been made might constitute even contempt of court. That was an issue which the Johannesburg High Court, in its judgment on the weekend, didn't want to go into in an urgent application, but it still remains live for that case. So, to be quite honest, there are questions that are still unanswered relating to the litigation that flow from that litigation. So, I'm a little bit cautious to say that the entire matter is now put to bed completely. I think we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out after this announcement.
And another thing, of course, that was the court, the full bench, was asked to consider is this issue of whether or not the National Assembly should have another layer or needs to do more to vet the people who get sent to such an important body such as the Judicial Services Commission. So surely you're also looking forward to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly those broader questions which potentially are still capable of the court making a decision. Obviously, the question of whether it's moot or not will have to be considered. To an extent, this was a very exceptional circumstance. It was an unusual situation where we had someone who'd been removed as a judge, then being designated to the JSC. But yeah, it is important going forward that we think carefully about how that unfolded to avoid the situation again.
All right, that's Chris Oxtoby. He speaks on behalf of Freedom Under Law. The breaking news taking place just as Judge Leonie Windel was wrapping up her interview. She's the last candidate to have been interviewed here today. But certainly, as we speak now, the judges and the commission, I should say, is deliberating on the three vacancies that need to be filled on the Supreme Court of Appeal. But certainly certainly insofar as Dr. John Hlophe is concerned, now sending his resignation to the National Assembly to have his name withdrawn. In other words, the MK party will now have to send another name to have a representative here at the JSC. And, that matter in terms of Part B, there's still issues of costs, as you would have heard Oxter be mentioning, so not quite moot as yet.